Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Kenosha Public Library program, Kenosha County's ice harvesting industry, cold, hard cash. It is one of many events in our November adult events handout, including programs in the History and Mystery series. I'm Patty Bajabier, an adult and digital services librarian with our library system. During November 2021, you are invited to view a special exhibit in our North Side Library's lobby display case. It features educational materials, a very short video, and a number of artifacts from the Kenosha History Center related to our county's substantial historic ice harvesting industry. The public may see it whenever this neighborhood library is open. Visit the Kenosha Public Library website, mykpl.info for hours, or call us. The installation will be removed from the case on the last day of the month. We at the Kenosha Public Library are pleased and honored to welcome TaraDawn Knull as a presenter. Ms. Knull is the Archivist for the Sisters of St. Francis in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Her degree is in history with museum studies. Her previous professional position was curator of the Elgin Public Museum in Elgin, Illinois, and she also does speaking engagements. This particular subject is one she never thought would prove to be as fascinating as it really is. On her first day as an intern for the Kenosha History Center, she was handed the artifacts of a recently acquired ice harvesting collection and asked to do all the things with it, from cleaning and researching to mounting a permanent exhibit for the center. As Ms. Knull became absorbed in the work and learned more, the topic revealed itself to be much more than just some ice in rural Wisconsin. She is very glad she did not turn down the opportunity when curator and archivist Cynthia Nelson handed the project to her. On a humorous note, TaraDawn shared that her family and friends are grateful that she was invited by the Kenosha Public Library to speak, as they are all rather tired of hearing her discuss ice with them. This Chicago native is now safely behind Wisconsin's Cheddar Curtain and is often called the Ice Queen by Kenosha History Center staff. We have been granted permission to record this presentation and post it to Kenosha Public Library's YouTube channel within about a week. It will eventually be posted on media sites for the Kenosha History Center. So if you wish to experience it again or wish to inform others who have been unable to join us, please do so. It's a fascinating period of Kenosha County history, which the library is celebrating this month. Now I turn the program over to TaraDawn.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you to the Kenosha Public Library for this opportunity. I am always excited to talk about ice, and my friends and family, as you said before, are also grateful that I have others to talk to. And ice, so seemingly so boring a subject. It's ice, just frozen water, and we all have it in our freezers. It's so common we don't give it a second thought until it's not there, until it's August and your beer is not cold. These days, ice can be found everywhere, at least in the first world, that is. In the history of mankind, there have been three things that have changed the course of human history globally, huge direction changes, at least as far as food is concerned. And let's face it, food runs the world. First, we have to go do the technical thing and do the share screen thing. Hang on. There we go. First is fire. Food now lasts longer. Bear with me just a second. I have got to figure this out. How do we make this run? Here we go. First of the three is fire. Food now lasts longer, travels farther than was possible before. The second is salt. Now we have a preservative which prompted global movement, not just the next village, but global trade began to happen. And then came ice. It's the cold of ice that has allowed further global movement for food, the fresh food. Cold and food were introduced to each other long before one would think. It was when we gained the technology of storing that ice above ground in mass quantities is when we really saw that the global shift in how we interact with food. Do you get it? It was an amazing discovery, and ice is so awesome. Early in 2017, I was handed a collection of ice harvesting stuff by Cindy at the Kenosha History Center and was told to do all the things that we do in an archive. Sort, research, clean, number, catalog, and I really knew nothing about ice harvesting, a vague idea at best. Ice came from a lake and was kept in a shed with sawdust. Thank you, Little House on the Prairie, for that much at least. I've always been fascinated with the history of food, so in processing this collection, imagine my delight in finding out that ice was so responsible for how we see and treat food today. Where and how, really, did all of this begin? As far as anyone knows, the first to cut and store ice was the Chinese, around 1000 BCE. In Egypt and India, circa 500 BCE, water was boiled to release the air and placed in earthen pots wrapped in a wet cloth and left out overnight. The evaporation of the moisture on the outside of the pot, combined with the cool night air, produced intense cold within the pot, freezing the water solid overnight. Early Romans would collect snow from Mount Albanus at Hannibal's camp and ram it into cone-shaped pits that were 50 feet deep and 25 feet in diameter. These pits were lined with straw and tree prunings, which were also used to cover the top, along with a thatched roof. The solidified snow was cut with axes and picks and sent down to Rome for use in the summer. At the close of the 16th century in France, snow was used to cool liquors at the table of Henry IV. By the end of the following century, this became a profitable trade, although never a large one. Lack of rapid overland transportation restricted this trade. It was not until the 19th century that ice from northern regions such as Norway and Sweden was successfully shipped south by sea. Here in America, Frederick Tudor of Boston began the first successful ice trade in 1805 in response to the yellow fever ravaging the West Indies. The need for ice there prompted Mr. Tudor to speculate that shipping a boatload just might be profitable. Having grown up in a wealthy family, seeing ice harvested from the family's own ponds, Frederick was no stranger to the notion that ice was useful. The ice was cut and shipped by wagon to Charleston and loaded aboard the brig Favorite, which had been brought expressly for this venture. With 130 tons of ice aboard, the Favorite set sail for Martinique in 1805. The shipper lost $4,500 on the venture, as the people of Martinique, while welcoming the shipment, had no means of storing that ice. Much was lost to melt on the wharf once there. In 1807 saw Mr. Tudor's second attempt at shipping ice, this time to Havana. This and other early ventures did not yield profits, as nearly 50% of the cargo was lost in shipment. This, however, did not dissuade Tudor, as he continued shipments overseas to tropical ports. It was not until the spring of 1833 that he finally hit upon the perfect ship with a perfect tonnage of ice to the perfect port, Calcutta. What made this profitable was that although still losing 50% to melt during shipping, this ice from America was still 50% cheaper than the ice made in Calcutta which was being made by the pot method. So a practical trade was established, and soon Frederick Tudor was shipping ice worldwide, earning him the title of Ice King of the World. Upon his death in 1864, he left over $1 million to his heirs, which equates to just over $17 million in today's money. Quite profitable for a 33-year-old business with just frozen water, wouldn't you say? By 1880, it was estimated that the national total harvest of ice in the US was close to 8 million tons. Breweries were constituted the single largest group of consumers, with an estimated million tons a year to make and distribute their product, while another 2 million tons a year were needed to cool and serve it. In Wisconsin, this will come as no surprise. The primary reason for the rise in large-scale harvesting and shipping of natural ice was the expansion of the brewing and packaging industries in Milwaukee and also Chicago. An increasing beer drinking public with a preference for the new lighter beers at once helped Milwaukee become famous and created a huge demand for more ice. In the early 1880s, Milwaukee brewers alone were storing 335,000 tons of ice for their operations. In the absence of mechanical cooling, ice in these quantities were required in the manufacturing of light or lager beers and for the maintenance of low temps during the aging process. More significant to the harvesting of Wisconsin ice and its shipment to industrial cities and transportation centers was the growth of the great meat packing firms of Chicago, and to a lesser extent, Milwaukee. The development of an efficient refrigerated railroad car was a long and murky process. However, the success of Gustav Swift, a Chicago packer, in developing a practical system for shipping refrigerated meat by rail rapidly brought about the wide use of fresh meats. Meat processed in Chicago, kept unspoiled in storage and shipping, was now available throughout the continental US. Swift's success was quickly imitated by Armour and other meat packers. By 1900, refrigerator cars were not only bringing meat outside of major packaging cities, but also bringing into these cities fresh fruits and veggies, seafood, and other goodies from the coast and from the south. In the Midwest, the great cold storage plants continued with appendixes. The breweries continued to rely on natural ice for their operations. Even when mechanical cooling did become possible, easy and economic production of artificial ice remained a difficult process. And so natural ice was continued to be the favored method of cooling into the 20th century. Before the mid-1870s, the natural ice used commercially in Milwaukee and Chicago was largely harvested from local waters, ponds, flooded quarries, rivers, and even marshes. Although Pasteur and his germ theory was still in the future, and public health boards barely existed, in the harvesting of ice, some concessions were made to a hygiene apparently based on no more than the feeling of what smelled bad in liquid form should not, when frozen, be added to drinks or brought into contact with food and storage. Duh. One Milwaukee physician in 1855 objected strongly to drinking what was so difficult to inhale. This led to no more ice being taken from Milwaukee's badly polluted stretches of local rivers, and in the mid-1880s, cutting ice in the county, save for purposes of industrial cooling. The Armour Company and had an ice house in Pewaukee with a capacity of around 250,000 tons, making it one of the largest harvesters in the nation. In Milwaukee, the western shore of the Milwaukee River above the North Avenue Dam, as well as part of the eastern shore, became a row of ice houses at least half-mile long. During some very cold winters, the river, through repeated cuttings, was made to yield up to 250,000 tons to fill these houses. The breweries, ice houses in the city, and frequently dispatched thousands of tons to Chicago and other areas south. In the warm, rainy winter of 1877 to 1878, the ice crop around Milwaukee and Chicago all but failed, and then almost collapsed during the following winter practically everywhere in the nation, with the exception of Maine and Wisconsin. This resulted in Chicago looking to Wisconsin, to the series of lakes and ponds on the state line in Kenosha and Racine counties, Waukesha and Washington counties, and the lake south of Milwaukee and Madison, and even as far north as Sturgeon Bay and Green Bay. From this last area, the Washington Ice Company of Chicago, among others, cropped 100,000 to 300,000 tons of ice a year during the 1880s and 1890s, shipping horses, men, and equipment north to get the ice cut and stored. 5 large Chicago firms built 12 huge ice houses near these two cities in anticipation of summer shipments of ice south. Never very economical, the shipping of men and horses and equipment. In 1898, these consolidated into one and terminated their Wisconsin link. The tapping of the Lake County of southeastern Wisconsin, still close to Chicago, but north of and colder than the area around the southern end of Lake Michigan, was made economically possible by the widespread lines of the primary ice carrier, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul railroads, the expanding tracks of the Chicago and Northwestern, the north-south line of the Wisconsin Central, later the Sioux line, and the extension of the Illinois Central to Madison in 1891. Lakes near the rail lines throughout this whole region were only overnight from Chicago, a vital consideration for summer transportation of ice. Wisconsin lakes themselves were an ice cutter's delight. Many were dammed at their outlets soon after settlement in order to provide water power, and this raised water levels, eliminating much of the marshy shore and very shallow weed-infested waters. Most had sufficient water movement to provide solid, clear ice without inclusion of air bubbles, which was characteristic of the so-called pond ice. The ice was nearly always at least 12 to 14 inches thick, which meant it packed easily and did not shift during transport. In fact, Wisconsin and Maine ice was repeatedly mentioned in trade journals of the time as representing the ideal standard for thickness and hardness. The interest aroused by the state's superior natural ice resources, plus the prospect of much more extensive ice cutting, prompted the Wisconsin State Legislature of 1879 to require precise, defined, and secure fencing of areas being harvested on the lakes. The old legislation only requiring that there be casual heaps of brush or upended cakes of ice about the open areas was now abruptly replaced. Obviously, the greater frequency and larger size of open or thinly iced over areas required more substantial fences to protect other users of the frozen surfaces. Fishermen, farmers using the lake for easier travel and the like. Pabst after 1889, seems to have been the first to establish a permanent natural ice plant on the inland Wisconsin lakes. In the winter of 1878 to 1879, an ice house large enough to hold 50,000 tons was filled with ice from Pewaukee Lake. Keep in mind that this was during the first ice shortage of the warm winter. However, in the following years, as was the case with many Milwaukee brewers, Best decided to concentrate on beer and leave the ice harvesting to contractors, as in the mid-1880s, the brewery sold its Pewaukee plant to the Armour Company, which was snapping up ice houses for its packing house and its rapidly expanding refrigerator car business. During the next several years, Armour enlarged this ice house with a structure of more than 1,200 feet long, 200 feet deep, with a capacity of over 175,000 tons. In addition to the great sprawling ice houses, there were large barns for the horses, storage sheds for equipment, repair shops, coal bins, and large barrack-like boarding houses for the hundreds of men. Young men and farmers from miles about, casual workers from the harvest fields and from construction closed down for the winter, and workers recruited in the city and sent out in boxcars on the first empty freight trains bound for ice country each winter. At times, these men employed by the ice companies left the neighboring communities anything but quiet and peaceful. During stoppages due to thaws or prolonged sub-zero weather, they poured into the village saloons, often becoming highly boisterous, and sometimes precipitated near riots. With telephones available only in the later years of the trade, and often with no faster than horses to bring aid, maintaining order of several hundred overly excited young men in a strange village or company boarding house was a problem. There was also similar problems in hard times when men, desperate for jobs, showed up at the plants in greater numbers than were needed. During the harvesting season, unless stopped by intense cold or thaw, activity was often incessant day or night. Cakes of ice 22 inches by 22 inches were conveyed in a steady progression up the inclined elevators from the lake and along the galleries for switching into the rooms of the ice house, or along platforms for switching into railroad cars waiting 8 to 10 at a time to be loaded. 4 to 5 cakes high by tong men in the cars. When the ice was short to the south, the steady, tedious, and dangerous labor was interrupted only by breakdowns and by blasts of the whistle of the 65 horsepower steam engine signaling dinner time at the boarding house for the change in a 10-hour shift. The cars, sometimes as many as 200 to 300 a day, blocked county roads and village streets as they were slowly moved across the railroad scales at Milwaukee, and then gathered into trains to go south to the empty ice houses in Chicago, or to those in scores of railroad division towns throughout the Midwest, and in warm winters even farther afield in the country. Indeed, in these years of shortages, the cutting went on relentlessly until the ice was no longer safe to work upon. At night, which must have been a glorious sight, certainly in the late 1800s and 1890s, the whole curious and bizarre scene at Armour's in Milwaukee, the water box on the lake, the inclined elevators, the galleries, and the cavernous rooms of the ice houses were all dazzlingly lit by electricity, supplied by a dynamo and powered by the steam engines. No wonder the ice works were a spectacle to the rural areas and the small towns, and regarded as an outstretching of Chicago and Milwaukee into the lamplit countryside. Reflecting the extent of all this activity and the large numbers of operators of the bitterly competitive ice trade at the time, gambling on enough ice to survive the summer if supply was short, or on the possibility of a hot season if the harvest had been large, no cutter cared to expose his situation to his rivals and customers by reporting the actual tonnages stored in these houses. He seldom revealed the amount stacked outside his buildings in anticipation of shortage, very much like the ice cut and stored by the Irish laborers in Thoreau's Walden. In the East, throughout much of this time period, the Ice Trade Journal refused to accept figures save those actually collected by its own agents. The hot pursuit of so whimsical and unpredictable a market led to frequent outbursts of violence. Old men who were familiar with the trade as youth have been told writers' tales, made rather dim and foggy by the years, of lowering water levels at dams to destroy ice or fistfights, and of the destruction of railroad tracks and ties. Small town newspapers, frequently published miles from the actual events, were often and unfortunately more homiletical than factual in their stories about this kind of violence. However, one of these hot and not all unserious little wars broke out in Milwaukee in the winter of 1901 to 1902, under the amused eyes of Milwaukeeans, the local newspapers, and the local police force. The adjective, amused, seemed to be justified by the hilarious tone of the stories carried by the English-speaking press of the city, by the cheers of Milwaukeeans for nice strategy and skillful tactics on the few Sunday afternoons when fighting occurred, and by the sustained aloofness of the city police force unless they were too prolonged in serious pike pole play and resulting perforations. Only the reports of the German language Milwaukee Herald, with, it may be, some German educated staff members, seemed sufficiently startled by and incredulous of what they saw to write comparatively long and detailed laden stories of the events, and careful to follow through by noting the easy compromise and dismissal of the cases, both civil and criminal, in the local courts. What apparently happened was this. A new ice company had been formed in Milwaukee, the Pike and North Lake Ice Company, with the intention of winning a place for itself in the city's market by exploiting growing public squeamishness over the use of dirty ice from the Milwaukee River. The new company apparently planned to advertise that it used ice only from lakes remote from centers of population and hence pure. It obviously had supporting capital since it built large ice houses and had filled them in early winter. With a remissness, however, that was naive in its chosen business, the new company had not secured the land between its houses and the lines to the nearby railroad, and discovered too late that the crucial parcels had been secured by the agents of their largest Milwaukee competitor, or so they alleged. At any rate, The new owners refused either to sell out or to grant easement across their land for the construction of the spur lines, which were indispensable to shipping ice to the new houses. The owners of the Pike and North Lake Company, negligent though they may have been at first, now imaginatively and vindictively made their riposte. They purchased a large steam launch installed a heavy ice-breaking prow, clothed the vessel with boilerplate, launched it on the upper Milwaukee River the first week of the year, and advertised river excursions. Indeed, the first trips maintained this note of sardonic humor. A German band played brassy marches in the waist of the vessel, while it steered an erratic path through the plowed ice fields of the competing Wisconsin Lakes and Cartage Company, breaking them into flows which the current of the river bore over the dam. And the band played on. However, the husky youths on board with pike poles were far more than excursionists. They fought off the attacks of the men of the Wisconsin Lakes and Cartage Company, pried the vessel free when it stuck on ice too thick to be borne down and broken by the special prow, cut heavy strands of barbed wire strung from bank to bank, warded off heavy timbers studded with spikes launched by the defenders, and made patches when their armored vessel gained hold. This activity was maintained for nearly 6 weeks whenever the river refroze. No more ice was cut. One of the largest Milwaukee newspapers observed late in the struggle that the 200 who relied on the harvest for their winter livelihood were certainly ugly over the situation and might become dangerous. This kind of occurrence and the desire to prevent overcutting and to maintain prices led in 1898 to the consolidation of nearly all of the Chicago natural ice companies and a few of the nearby cities into the Knickerbocker Ice Company. The Packer-connected houses were not included. In part, the reaction in Wisconsin to this situation was the Overback Ice Bill, which became law during Robert M. La Follette's first term as governor. Indeed, the bill appears to have been the only bit of new legislation enacted in this stormy session. The act declared that the ownership of all meandered streams in Wisconsin was vested in the state, and ownership, it followed, which embraced the ice cut from its waters. As owner, the state was to levy a charge of 10 cents a ton upon all ice cut for shipment out of Wisconsin. The proceeds to go to the state school fund. The bill was repealed in 1903. Indeed, natural ice seemed to be losing its vogue. The increasing amounts of ice required for cooling and the inflexibility of the supply available, whether the summer was hot or cool, and management appears helpless or irrelevant. Large suppliers like Knickerbocker began to sell installations and rely upon smaller supplies and higher prices and more predictable profits. In Chicago, the natural ice combine began to lose out to the artificially produced product of the Consumers Ice Company. Swift, Armour, and the rest faced a hostile Interstate Commerce Commission in the matter of their control over icing charges for their refrigerator cars. And in 1906, when the Hepburn Act gave the commission power to regulate change, it promptly did so. In June 1905, when the huge Armour plant in Pewaukee burned to the ground, a fire which eventually required the services of a full fire company from Milwaukee shipped out on railroad flat cars, no serious effort was made to rebuild the complex. As a matter of fact, the houses were only half full at the time of fire and apparently were being used more as a margin of security than a main supplier. Even the railroads now seemed a bit weary of transporting the great amounts of ice which they had once prized. Growing shipments of coal, for example, now concerning them increasingly during the winter months. By 1900, the transport of grain from the West was an activity lasting long into the winter. No longer was there a lull following the fall and early winter movement of wheat, into which ice transportation had fit comfortably and profitably despite low rates. The apparent lack of railroad concern was reflected in the practice of dispatching to the large ice harvesting plants too few cars, unswept cars, and even unclean slated cattle cars. In addition, the Health Board of Chicago was casting a pall over the use of natural ice in that city. Giving sufficient powers in 1895 and 1896, and supported by a public now much more germ conscious, the board scrutinized the sources of natural ice carefully. On grounds of impurity, much of the cutting about Chicago ended, and the great installations on Wolf and Cedar Lakes in Indiana were either shut down or were used much more sparingly. By 1908, the Chicago domestic market was closed to ice from all the Madison lakes used for cutting, with the exception of Lake Wingra. Knickerbocker, although it continued to cut on Lake Wingra, slowed its activities abruptly, and by the end of World War I was out of Madison entirely. By 1917, it had also shut down its operations in the Oconomowoc area and was withdrawing from the lakes inland from Kenosha. By this time, the Consumers Ice Company, with its emphasis on artificial ice, had absorbed Knickerbocker of Chicago. Rather ironically, artificial ice was still far from beyond reproach. It was still often tainted by ammonia. It still contained occasional drops of oil and could be no purer than the city water from which it was made. In the instances of Milwaukee and Chicago at the time, purity was not pronounced. Chicago's city water was still untreated, and in Milwaukee, 171 people died in 1910 of a large waterborne typhoid fever. The retreat from natural ice on the grounds that artificial ice was somehow pure seems to have been determined more by a concern for overall sanitation and by fastidiousness than by considerations of public health. During World War I, many of the remaining large plants and all of the smaller houses were used to their limits in America's extended efforts to move foodstuff abroad. By similar demands were made of artificial ice plants, and but similar demands were made of artificial ice plants, and under the pressure, significant improvements were made in technology and materials. A development which was accelerated by the discovery that munitions could be better manufactured and stored under conditions created by mechanical refrigeration. At the end of the war in 1919, the way was open not only to better and cheaper artificial ice, but also to effective small-scale mechanical cooling and freezing. The natural ice business now appeared as anachronistic as the huge trembling and decaying structures still standing on Wisconsin Lake and river shores. Finally, the unseasonably warm winters of 1920 and 1921, in which southeastern Wisconsin experienced an average temperature of below freezing only in December and January, brought an end to many of the larger companies still trying to function. Ice where it was formed was thin, honeycombed, and shot through with dirt blown from the bare land. Large-scale natural ice harvesting for shipment and industrial use was almost entirely a finished enterprise within the state. In the grand scheme of things, a very short-lived industry, although highly profitable, it seems. It wasn't the advent of the electric refrigerator that was the downfall of the ice industry. That was actually invented in 1834. Really, it was. It was the first working vapor compression refrigerator. It wasn't until electricity was made available to the general, not rich public that they became ubiquitous in every kitchen. Even up until the mid-1960s, ice boxes were common in rural areas. And I hear tell that some up in Door County still use ice boxes in summer cottages. I've talked a lot about this industry, but we'll take a minute to look at the actual process of harvesting ice. As we talked about on the Milwaukee River, which this picture is from, it began with ice plows and horses, which cut about 6 to 7 inches deep in a checkerboard type pattern. They couldn't go all the way through the ice. This was just the beginning. And then men with poles and specially created ice saws would then cut these into larger sections, which were put into smaller sections and by hand moved up into these great conveyor belts to be put into the ice house. This was not a process that was ever successfully able to be done by anything except manpower. Inside the ice house, they would grab with longer hooks and pull them into storage, putting sometimes lake weed in between. The wood shavings were really only used in shipping as it presented a cleaner look. Standing on these ice floes, as you can see next to these houses, as the winters warmed and as the ice was cut, was really very dangerous. That's not dangerous. And what do we have today because of ice? If you have an answer to that question, put it into the chat. What do we have today because of ice? Obviously, we have ice cream. We have those wonderful Jell-O salads. We also have things like organ transplant, which would not be possible without a way to cool it down. And of course, we have beer.